we're going to talk about, we've got finished up with sauropods, and now we're going to talk about theropods. Theropods, of course, being the other branch of our saurischians, right? So we are dealing with the lizard-hipped dinosaurs that give rise to birds, which have a bird hip, which looks like the bird-hipped dinosaurs. In any case, these organisms, of course, are a group that are well studied for a variety of reasons, but they also are just cool in their own right, and they're also the group we're going to spend a long time with, partially because of the amount of information that's been gathered about them, and partially, again, because we have members we can actually look at today. So obviously this member here we don't have a chance to look at. This is a tyrannosaurid, but I want you just to be aware that that's a larger group. This is Albertosaurus, and it's a smaller member of that group, but it does have the characteristic two fingers, right? So if you just look at two-fingered theropod dinosaurs, not all of them are Tyrannosaurus. In fact, some may be a completely different genus, though they may belong to that group. So I think that theropods, anyway, especially the animals from the Mesozoic, are really some of the most awesome animals to evolve on the Earth. Now, that I still think sauropods are probably my favorite group, but I think theropods bring some really cool stuff to the table. If you look at theropods, right, when we're gonna talk about them being primarily carnivorous, of course, but they evolve some of the largest meat-eating animals to ever live on the planet, right? These are big animals, and they are also, in fact, some of the smallest vertebrates on the planet as well. So they have a lot of very cool things, and then I think one of the more important things for dinosaurs especially, and for vertebrate lineages, this is one of a few lineages to achieve flight, and the second lineage within the archosaurs actually to achieve flight. The archosaurs actually evolved flight twice independently and within some reasonably close time frame to one another. Mammals evolve it much later with bats. And at least for theropods, these guys are what we think of when we're looking at primitive characteristics for dinosaurs. We think that theropods really represent the branch that most closely resembled very early basal dinosaurs. Now that, again, we are now questioning that to some degree, but they do appear, if our old hypotheses are correct, they do appear to be that. They're carnivorous, bipedal, relatively mobile, usually small to medium, although we do have large animals. We're going to deal with, in this lecture, non-avian theropods. So we're not going to deal with any avians today. We're going to deal with non-avian theropods, and I'm really not going to deal with avians very much in this class. We're going to get into avians that basically lose teeth, and then almost immediately at that point I'll stop, because that is where ornithology picks up, and so we won't extend into that. Of course, you've seen this many times now. Now we're going to deal with this, what is apparently much more diverse and speciose group. Again, that's a reflection more of this diagram set up than the actual fact that they were definitely more speciose. But what I do want you to see here is there actually is some diversity within body types. You've actually seen members down here, and you'll see members all the way at the top. Of course, the members up near the top of this chart represent animals that you are very comfortable with, but there's a variety of stuff that goes on in between as well. Theropods, of course, are worldwide in their distribution. They are always worldwide in their distribution, and they are common within that. And they appear to have retained the top predator within all environments throughout the Mesozoic. So once they establish as the dominant, so that the end of, or the beginning of the Jurassic, during the end of the Triassic extinction event, they establish as top predators in all of those environments. They retain that until the end of the Cretaceous. And they actually do remain as top predators in some rare environments, in especially islands and cutoff areas where some mammals are not able to get to after that event. In any case, these guys are obligate bipeds. They are generally, we don't really have what we think of as quadrupedal theropods. Most of these are actively running animals. They are probably fairly fast. Modern theropods are a little bit different than the theropods you see in museums. Modern theropods, of course, do not have tails, and so that's actually really important for running. There's a lot of muscle that gets pulled up into the back onto the tail itself structure proper, and that actually helps with running. So not having a tail does have a cost. As a result, birds actually maneuver their legs slightly differently within the body. So instead of having the knee fully extend away from the body, it actually comes well up into the body cavity. So they run with a bent knee, and they do most of the flexing around the ankles. So they have very, very long ankles, and their legs tend to be pushed up near the body cavity if they're runners. And that's unusual because most theropods have traditionally had a much longer leg, with still fairly long ankle, but not using that as the primary flex point for these guys. But modern avian theropods are relatively fast, and we suspect that they are in line with what primitive members of this group were also capable of. Ostriches at 40 miles per hour are not uncommon. They can do that, and they can run for fairly long distances. There is some discussion about how fast is fast, so let me open this up. Okay, so in that comment there, they mentioned that we do not have T-Rex tracks. So that actually changed last year. We do have T-Rex tracks. Or actually, it was published this year. It was available last year. But that was published not very long ago, that we do have some tracks of T-Rex. And this animal was walking along what would be a tidal area that would have been wet, sandy substrate. And that looks like from the trackways, you can tell partially by the depth of this track, that this is a very heavy animal and a very soft substrate. It's putting a lot of, which again is not terribly surprising for a Tyrannosaurus. You're putting a lot of weight down on the surface, and that's digging in relatively deeply. And this animal is probably moving at about 4.5 to maybe 8 kilometers an hour, which seems relatively slow, but isn't terribly surprising if you're a large animal walking on shifting sand. You're not going to go particularly fast. So that animal is probably sort of strolling along the edge of a beach, whether it was following the edge of the beach as a way of keeping itself oriented, or whether it was looking for animals or material washed up on a beach is a different question that we can't answer. But these guys at least give us the first trackway.
How are these trackways like withstanding time?
We have to get buried.
Well, they get buried, but they don't get filled in, really?
Well, if they get filled, so if you have a trackway get buried and they get filled in with a softer substrate, right? Then you have an already compressed component filled in with a softer component, and that may erode out before the other one. Or you can have components that are protected, so something lands on top of it, and then you can actually see the under track, so we can see what the compression underneath it. You can go see trackways that way. Trackways are common because of the vast amount of tracks that individuals make, but not common because you are correct. It is easy to lose tracks. If it rains, you can lose tracks, right? So it's easy to get rid of them. Most members, of course, do 3 toes in front, sometimes 1 behind. Some members do not. What famous groups do this type of trackway? What is that group from? What kind of raptors? These are the classic velociraptor type animals, right? So how do we know that velociraptors hold their claws off the ground? Because we have trackways where they're holding the claw off the ground. And that makes good sense if you want to keep it really sharp, right? So they're probably using that as a cutting claw and prevent wear and tear on it during normal walking. It's rotated up and away from the ground, and you can see that very distinctly in that foot, right? 2, and then the third is actually what looks like a stub. It looks like the toe was cut, but it's not quite.
So this is not like a dew claw on a dog where it's been shifted up. This is like they're actually
No, their inside toe is actually would have been held up and pulled back with a tendon. A muscle would have contracted and pulled that up and away. And then when that was to be used, then it could be pulled down and used as a slashing motion. And you can see this one, again, this animal is clearly trotting along. The footprints aren't really in line with each other. You can see that they're sort of distinctly out of line. And you can see that these animals were quite happily capable of probably slashing quite large animals with those toes. And the idea of Jurassic Park where they're clicking every time they walk, absolutely not the case, because if it was clicking every time it would have walked, it would have left a claw mark in front of each pathway. Although it does make a really cool sound. Modern theropods usually do the 3+1. Sometimes it's just 3. Ostriches are actually 2 now, but they do not have a slashing claw. But this is an ostrich foot, and you can see it's just 2 toes. In addition to that, the toes are usually very constrained, so we know what most feet of theropods look like. A lot of them do have grasping hands, so they have hands that are clearly used for manipulation of items. I'm not saying that they are writing books, but they are probably manipulating things in front of them, whether it be small items, whether it be smaller animals, whether it be nest material or something like that. But the other, we do have a lot of members that have modified the arms. Of course, you know of some. We have a lot of members that have greatly reduced the arms, and we have lots of members that have reduced or changed the number of digits, especially on the hands. The feet that seem pretty constrained, there's not a lot of play. Once you're down to 3 toes, you can't do that much more. You can get rid of maybe one more, but that's about it. You're not going to get rid of much more than that. So T-Rex arms, of course, are the classic example of an animal that has these very reduced arms. T-Rexes belong to a group of Tyrannosaurids, and they appear to have lost their length of arm and size of arm very, very quickly. Although Tyrannosaurus rex actually retains relatively strong arms, they're just very small. But other groups did the same sort of things. Here's Carnotaurus. This one is a primitive member of the group. It's much smaller than T-Rex, but you can see it still has the many little fingers on the hand there. But the arms are really tiny and appear weak. They may have been on the order of vestigial at that point. Again, we have these the paired 3 toes here with one in back, right? So that's classic for theropods. I like this too because it's a really nice model that's done. But this is probably, I think, more realistic, not like the floppy noodle arms that you saw in the last picture. This is probably what's happening. The arms are probably tucked back in a way as you would see it. As far as we know, they do nothing, but don't write it off because even when structures get very, very small and they don't appear to have an immediate function with, say, like feeding, there's a lot of uses for even very small structures, whether it be in mating or whether it just be a display item, or it can be for something else that we haven't yet conceived of. So I'll say right now they don't appear to be very useful, but the fact that they're still there does suggest they have some functionality. Sometimes modern birds use them just to push, even very small wings, just to push branch material away from them.
Is there any species that has completely gotten rid of the front limbs?
Completely gotten rid of the front limbs? Basically, yeah, within the birds. There are groups that have, but getting rid of them entirely is hard. But there are groups that have gotten rid of hind limbs. So it is possible to completely lose them. But it does take time. It takes time to do that. So it may be that you're seeing sort of an intermediate stage within that. I also like this guy because he's got cool horns on top of his head. Of course, theropods are also well known for their teeth, right? These are clearly by and large, these are clearly predatory animals. They're clearly in general, relatively fast runners that are hunting down prey. And they tend to have teeth that are usually recurved and flattened side to side, right? And why would that be the case? What's the point of having teeth like that? Flattened meaning that it looks like they're compressed, and they're compressed in this distribution, not in this way. So they're compressed like that. So why are they flattened in side to side? It's probably not about necessarily having more teeth because you don't have teeth outside of your teeth, right? We don't have teeth sticking out like that. We don't have multiple rows of teeth.
Well, does it say like teeth replacement?
It's not for teeth replacement, although changing the amount that would be present, let's look at it like this. So if you look at a big broad tooth, let's say it was not flattened, you would get something like this, which would be, if you cut it, it would be sort of circular and cross-section. If you look at a theropod tooth, they look much more like this, with a very clean cut. So what?
For a more piercing bite?
Yeah, so this is the reason that you make knives thin, right? What you really want on a knife is a good cutting edge, and so right at the cutting edge you want it to be very, very thin because that's where you want to do the actual slicing. That makes it easier for the material to cut through another. And then this, having lots of these, right, makes it really easy to puncture through the skin of other animals, especially very, very thick-skinned animals.
This is a little off topic. A lot of bird species today don't have the capacity to move their eyeballs, so they have to move their entire head. Was that the case with Mesozoic theropods as well?
No. Mesozoic theropods, that probably evolved to help birds fly. So we haven't talked about that yet, but that's probably related to bird flight. No, Mesozoic theropods would have been very capable of moving their eyes around in their heads, not dissimilar from what you see in other groups. And then within the teeth themselves, many of these are, of course, serrated, which is not terribly different from the way that your knives are serrated for different purposes. Some knives are just a flat edge. Some knives for carving are serrated so that you get the carving action and you can cut more easily through muscle material, right? And so that's what serrated teeth are for. Some are for holding and killing live prey, and then some teeth are clearly designed for a bite and slash where you just come in, bite, and then release. And I think we're going to, for the purposes of this, we're going to skip this. But this is a Komodo dragon skull. This is not Theropod. This is a Komodo dragon, still related to some degree. And this animal is a classic example of a bite and slash predator. So they don't really have serrations because they're not trying to cut through material, right? It's one bite and then they pull away. So they just want to cut. They just want to grab, slice, and come right back out. The teeth are very strongly recurved, so if they grab anything and they want to hold on to it, the direction that item will tend to go is backwards, right? Because if it moves on the tooth, it will tend to go backwards further into the mouth instead of forward. And then they have relatively robust teeth throughout the jaw because they're not entirely sure exactly where they're going to grab the prey item. It's just going to be in the jaw somewhere, so they're going to need to have the same robustness throughout in case they grab it at a different location. And these animals will bite and then release. Now, if you compare here to an Allosaurus skull, what you see is there's some similarity here. Allosaurs clearly have some amount of bite and slash material here, but the teeth are not quite large enough. They're not quite the same forward to back. And so this animal is probably using a modified version of that, where it's probably biting into an animal, injuring it severely, and then going in and finishing it off in that way. Allosaurs are related to some degree to T-Rexes, but they are much earlier. They evolved in the Jurassic, and so they simply don't have they have not yet evolved many of the features that would allow them to get as large as T-Rex does. Still very cool animals. And you can see, was there a... Oh, okay. Well, that's fine. You can see there's lots of openings here. These are probably sensory pits that are used when the animal is near a prey item or when it's detecting things. And some obvious features like very large eye sockets and very large nasal sockets in these guys. We do have coprolites, of course, so we do have poop samples from some of these guys. Not a lot. A lot of stuff I'm showing you here is from T-Rex. That's because T-Rex is relatively well studied to some degree, even though we don't have that many. It's really, really interesting for a lot of people. This coprolite here is probably a T-Rex coprolite just based on its size and location within the fossil record. And animals like T-Rex appear to be eating a lot of bone at the same time. So theropods that you think of are probably also eating small animals all the way up to consuming the largest animals wholesale by just chomping through bone material and eating it entirely. And so this coprolite is actually filled with bone material, including things like ceratopsian frill, right? So that did not protect that particular individual, and then that animal became more tyrannosaur.
Has there been a conclusion whether T-Rex was a carnivore or a scavenger?
So if you are dealing with carnivores or scavengers for T-Rex, the answer is if T-Rex found something, it's a scavenger. But the animal is overbuilt to be just a scavenger. Its body is far too massive, and there's far too many muscles for it for that just to be a scavenger in that case. It's also true that very large animals in ecosystems will scavenge happily, and they do so regularly, and they'll in fact scavenge from other animals very regularly, but they also themselves will hunt. They need to hunt to provide enough nutrition. It's just not common enough to run into corpses that frequently in that way. So T-Rex is certainly... There's still debate about it, but I suspect the answer is, and I think the community has largely agreed at this point, T-Rex is a very large super carnivore that scavenges regularly, which is not terribly surprising. So this is one of those. And then on top of that, many theropods also have lost their teeth or did lose their teeth. This is one of those, this is that ostrich mimic, which is not really fair because ostriches evolved much later, so it's not mimicking the ostrich so much as the ostrich is mimicking it. But these are struthiomiids, and these are bipedal, and they probably fill a very similar niche to ostriches. They're probably generalists, they're feeding on lots of different stuff, and they're probably more in the order of an omnivore, eating primarily animals, but frequently mixing in lots of plant and vegetable matter as well. These guys lost their teeth. This reconstruction I'm showing you right here is what we think they look like because we now have impressions and we also have fossil detailing us, showing us where feather attachments were, and it seems that adults look like this and juveniles did not have these big long feathers in the arms, which strongly suggests a sexual selection feature there. Oviraptors also lost their teeth. These guys had very robust heads and these very cool hatchet-like heads, and they are also toothless. And this reconstruction is also based on what we think they probably look like. The colors are hypothesized, but this is starting to look more and more what we think that these animals actually look like. And then, of course, modern aves have given up teeth as well. So we've had lots of groups that have given up teeth, and these can't be all of them. We're almost certainly missing lots of group that gives up teeth, but these are at least give you some idea of the versatility within the theropods. Brains of theropods, as you would expect for predators, are usually extensively located, are large compared to the other members of the groups that we've seen. A lot of them tend to be oriented towards increased sight, and then many of them, of course, also can do have relatively good senses of smell and probably relatively good senses of hearing. Now, that doesn't mean that theropods are really, really smart. That just means that theropods, relative to other dinosaurs, are relatively intelligent. And that's fine. That gets them by quite easily. I think let's look at this balance video. In addition to that, we have, of course, we have skin impressions. So we have lots of skin impressions, but we have some here. This is a skin impression from this theropod, not dissimilar from the Carnotaurus you saw before, or the Carnotaurus remaking you saw before. But you can see that this guy has large bumps embedded within some smaller scales. So this one clearly reptile-like in the sense that we think of them. We're not going to deal too much right now with the way that they appear because it really does require time out of the way to talk about it. But one of the things that I do want you to start to think about right now is we know that birds are related and we know that birds have feathers, so when do feathers appear within the fossil record? Well, we're starting to find more and more that feathers appear fairly early. So this is actually the tail of what's called Tyrannosaurus, which is a primitive member of the Tyrannosaurs. What you can see here, these slashes up here, are actually primitive feathers on the tail of the Tyrannosaurus. So that animal would certainly have had feathers extending off of the back of that animal. And so when did Tyrannosaurus live? Well, Tyrannosaurus appears somewhere into the middle of the Cretaceous, so feathers certainly around. But you know that birds appeared well before that point, so feathers must have appeared sometime prior to that, which means that if another group has feathers and birds have feathers, that probably a lot of members have feathers. And we need to spend some time thinking about how that actually reflects our understanding of dinosaurs, but we're not going to do that right now. If you also look at vision, color vision of birds is not like us. Birds actually see in the UV, and they see more like primitive fish, which also tend to see in the UV spectrum. Mammal vision is very, very different. We don't see in the UV, and many mammals actually see in a predominantly gray-black, or some variant of that. Humans are very, very special amongst the mammals because we see this blue spectrum, which most mammals simply do not see in any way. Why is mammal vision so different than bird vision?
Isn't it because mammals are a lot more scent-based than sight-based?
But why?
Mating rituals?
No, it's not mating. We don't think it's mating rituals.
Isn't it because didn't mammals first evolve at night?
Why do mammals evolve at night?
Because wasn't it right around because reptiles were out in the day and they predominantly ruled. So
The archosaurs, and then classically we think of the dinosaurs, are out predominantly taking up large terrestrial body size niches, which means small body size niches are available. Small body sizes tend to want to feed at night. There's a couple of reasons for that. Part is you don't need to worry about sight as much. You don't have to worry about being hunted. A small-bodied organism has a harder time seeing a long distance than a large-bodied organism. It's very easy for me to see a far distance. You can imagine it's very, very difficult for a mouse to see the same distance with the same eye because it has a much smaller eye, right? So it becomes more difficult in that way. And so often those small animals will expose themselves to predation only at night because it reduces the predation risk because their larger predators are going to rely on sight to hunt them. That means that for many millions of years, animals, or mammals I should say, were small in general. That doesn't mean they were all small, but they were generally small, and they predominantly did their work at night, and they lost all of these receptors. So we had to re-evolve them later. So scent, the reason that mammals seem so focused on scent is, again, probably because a lot of the time at night, you're not going to rely on vision, you're going to rely on scent. And mammal eyes, by and large, if you look at them, really look like modified nocturnal eyes. They really don't have the range and scope that bird eyes, for instance, have. And they are really evolved to be exposed to lots of sunlight. So you can thank the dinosaurs that we have less than perfect vision now. That's their fault. We probably should have evolved a little bit faster after the Permian-Triassic boundary. But that raises lots of very interesting components now, right? The evolution of mammals is partially driven by their interaction of dinosaurs 150, 200 million years ago, right? That's a really interesting dynamic that's still playing out in that way. And then I really wanted to show you this because this is, I think, a fossil that is rare enough and amazing enough that it deserves to be seen. This, of course, is what? It's a velociraptor. And what is this guy? Protoceratops, for sure. And then what's going on here? This is how this fossil was found. This is not mounted. This is how it was found. They are fighting. This fossil is actually called the fighting dinosaurs. What has happened is, you can't quite see it here, but the beak of the Protoceratops is broken off, but it's holding on to the velociraptor's arm, so it's grabbed and holding the arm within the beak. And the velociraptor had its leg in the neck, and it probably had severed the arteries around the neck of the Protoceratops, so the Protoceratops is probably dead. And then the velociraptor probably could not get out of that grip, so it probably died there. And probably some material like they either fought near a material that slumped on top of them, or these animals died and were then buried later, happened within that area. So these guys died together and they died fighting each other. So that suggests, of course, one, that Velociraptor actively hunted and ate Protoceratops, which shouldn't be terribly surprising. They overlapped in space and time. And two, that they regularly fought. And some of the ways that we think about modern mammals fighting are ways that ancient dinosaurs also fought, right? And so this is not particularly surprising. And that is the Protoceratops using its frill to defend itself is maybe another question we could ask. And I guess to a degree it is, because these long squamosal bones are sticking out here and protecting it, but certainly the back of the frill is not providing protection against a splashing cut underneath. And you can start to get an idea about what that claw may be useful for, right? It's probably to deliver killing blows to the neck region.
I was gonna say, so this would be a good example of like how versatile like the Velociraptor really would have been. It would have been like fighting back and
It would have been, you can imagine, well, when you are fighting, what you end up, and this is why predators have very high mortality rates, you can get injured by your prey animal very easily. And so prey animals will frequently try to put you in positions where you have the least amount of power, in the sense that they, for instance, they're not going to expose their neck and lay on their side, right, where you can stand above them and just slash into their neck. A great place to be would be underneath, where you could roll down and push down pressure on top of that. So this may be a natural way for one to be pushing down on top of the other.
did Velociraptors fight in groups or?
So then this raises another question. So does this mean that they hunted in packs? And you would think that, oh, if this animal hunted in a pack, then surely another member would have come along and helped to start eating that animal, and that would have helped to release that animal's arm. Okay, that's true, maybe, unless the animal was fighting alone, so maybe they did hunt alone, or maybe this animal was buried so rapidly during the fight that the other members ran away. But yeah, that does raise questions about, are they hunting in packs? We would like to say definitely 100% yes, but we don't know, and this is only a snapshot. It's literally a second of time that's caught for us, and then we can look at it. So this is one example. It gives you at least one opportunity to say Velociraptors probably kept on the menu Protoceratops, and even adult ones were probably really vulnerable to these guys. This is the same fossil. In this way, it's reconstructed. This is recast with all the bones, right? But you can see it's just easier to see here with the bones laid out next to each other. What else do these guys eat? They eat lots of stuff. This is Compsognathus. This is a fairly small, primitive member of the group, and we used to say it definitely had Compsognathus members within its own gut, but it turned out that they were just very small diapsid reptiles, which look very similar. And then what is this guy? That is Baryonyx, which is related to Spinosaurus. And Spinosaurus is a classic, I should say it's a more recently described in some ways member. This goes back to World War II as well. The original Spinosaurus bones were stored in Germany in a museum. The Americans bombed those museums and destroyed the bones, so we lost the original Spinosaur skeleton, and it wasn't until much later after the war that we found more. In any case, Baryonyx, which has a very distinctly crocodile-like head, we find in nearshore environments, and lo and behold, it has acid-etched fish scales within its gut. And we also find Baryonyx, at least in one case, teeth within a pterosaur bone, so we're probably eating pterosaurs as well. And the same thing for Spinosaurs, we tend to find the etched scales of fish within their guts. So they're probably nearshore animals that are living in coastal regions and feeding on fish and animals that come in close. In addition to that, we also have theropods clearly eating other animals. This is very distinctly a bite mark on a pelvis. This is from a T-Rex, right? This is clearly chewed through the bone, and not chewed through, just punctured right through it. So T-Rex bite forces are some of the highest that have ever been measured. They aren't the highest, but they're very, very high. You can think of them as predators that many predators avoid bone because it breaks teeth. T-Rex would just crush through the bone. So if they met a bone, they would just crush it and then consume everything in it. Hence the reason that coprolite had a bunch of bone in it, right? It's just eating all of that. So those are more like this, and you can see where teeth are popping out or breaking into the bone itself, and that T-Rexes would have lost teeth very regularly and replaced them throughout their lives without problem. And then you can also find other things. Here's a vertebrae with some teeth lodged within it. That animal probably went on to live. You can see that there's healing around it, so that animal probably survived. So it was bitten, and then they broke off a predator's tooth and then went on. But theropods are clearly important members of these ecosystems, right, because they're eating a lot of these guys we've been talking about. Cannibalism, your book talks about this. I have no idea why. It seems very weird to me from the topic of biology. Cannibalism is really something we talk about with humans because humans have a strong desire not to eat one another, and there's usually social constructs that prevent that. That's not true of the rest of the animal kingdom for everybody. Animals will happily eat other animals of the same species. They don't sit there and go, well, it is the same species, so I don't feel, it doesn't feel right. Chimps will eat other chimps, so the idea that cannibalism would not have happened would be unusual rather than it being sort of out of the norm. So just ignore that in general. You can expect that theropods, if they ran into smaller members of their own species, would have happily consumed them. There's no reason that they wouldn't have. And then this is another T-Rex thing, but I did want to give you this. This is Sue's jaw, and Sue has a number of holes within her lower mandible here. You can see them scattered around. Does anyone know why that might be the case? An infection. Yeah, so this is very common. It's common pathology we see in birds as well. They get holes within the lower mandible. It eventually swells, and the jaw usually can't open, and the bird starves to death. And that's probably what happened to Sue. She probably starved to death. And that's from a parasite, a small protist that was living within the body. And that Sue probably went off, and the reason she was probably found is because she probably went off to die alone, right? So she probably went somewhere, wasn't feeding, and was away from everyone, and then died, and then was buried, and then we found her, right? And so she actually probably died of starvation. There's also a very unusual group of theropods. These guys, which are, you can think of them we think they're sort of like sloths. They're probably herbivores. They were initially, these claws were assumed to be foot claws, and they're assumed to be huge. They're going to be really, really big theropods that eat everybody. It turns out they're probably herbivores, and they're probably really crappy herbivores in the sense that they really wouldn't have had chewing, and they weren't as well evolved for snipping as some of the members of the sauropods, but they seem to have gotten by, at least in a few cases. Probably they were isolated from other areas where those more advanced chewers and plant eaters could get access to. And I think I'm going to stop there for now because we have enough to do that I'm not going to try to push through it, but we'll return to theropods in next lecture. Okay, so let's bring it back to this end of this lecture. If you looked at the change to the schedule, today was supposed to be Theropods 2, 1, and 2, or the end of 1, beginning of, and the completion of 2. I shifted that just slightly. I've eliminated one of the chapters in your book, which is called Flowering in the Mesozoic. Flowering in the Mesozoic in your book is not a bad chapter, but it is a component I think that we've covered enough in lecture, which is sort of the larger scale view of dinosaur evolution. I've tried to capture that, and we also got part of that at the beginning of the class when we did vertebrate history. So I'm not going to reiterate it again. You're welcome to read the chapter. It's a very short chapter, and it's not particularly hard to read. It's a good refresher for some of the stuff that we've already done. When I look back at the slides, a lot of the slides were very similar to slides that we've already done, so I didn't feel like we needed to just go through the same slides again. So I've eliminated that. I've added this video on T-Rex, which we'll see just after this. So we're going to get through this component, and then we can start on that. So we're still dealing with theropods. Remember, I would say we're dealing with basal theropods or even advanced theropods, but non-bird theropods. So, of course, we would expect some behavioral similarities to them as well. One of them, of course, is that we know that these animals, for at least some of them, did spend time in groups, and that's not surprising. The coelophysids, or the coelophysoids, are small, bipedal. They're the little guys in Jurassic Park 2 that hunt that girl on the beach, and then she gets eaten, or I forget, did she die? She doesn't die. She does die.
I think she does.
Well, that's too bad. But those little things, that's about the right size for those guys, and that's probably sort of the behavior that they would have, where they would work together in a small group, maybe not in sort of an intelligent fashion, but if they find an item, they would all arrive and then start to tear that item apart. They're probably relatively skittish, right? And so if there was a large predator around, they would leave. So they're unlikely to bring down a human in that way, but if you had died, then a lot of them might congregate around you and eat you. Or like the giant velociraptors, the size of a man in Jurassic Park. The other thing is, of course, that there are other theropods that we think probably spent very, very little time in groups. Those are going to tend to be the largest animals, right? Probably aren't spending a lot of time in the group. There probably just aren't large enough masses of prey items for them to spend lots of time. So T-Rex is probably a solitary hunter, and probably dangerously so. They probably kill each other if they ran across each other in their own territories. And then ornamentation on these guys, so to facilitate this social behavior, is probably relatively intense, and there's probably lots of colors for it, and you can expect that, again, based on birds, right? Lots of visual signaling and lots of different ornamentation to tell people about who you are, and what you want, right? There's a lot of stuff that goes on with that. And a lot of that's probably also going to be related, of course, to sexual selection. This is another very famous fossil. I've tried to show you some famous fossils here, partially because they are so cool in this course, partially because they are just so wonderful in this way. And what is this fossil doing? What is it?
Tending its eggs.
Yep. And what do you know? What species this is? This is an oviraptor. Yep. And this is tending the eggs, and it's doing it in a very specific fashion, which is the way that birds do it. And that is that the So the animal probably sat like this, right? This is the original state of the animal. And then at some point, the top of the animal was eroded away, and we were left with the bottom, allowing us to see and then see those eggs. So there are some really wonderfully preserved specimens that we can get access to. So at least for some animals, there's clearly brooding of eggs, right? This is also a little bit unfair, this picture. You can see the eggs are haphazardly laid in there. That's not the case. Bird eggs are asymmetrical. They, or I should say they're polar so that they can be sat down into the sediment, and that's the way you saw those eggs. They were positioned within the nest in a circular pattern so the adult could sit squarely in between them, and so the eggs could be angled in towards the adult in that way, and probably not dissimilar from the way that birds do. As a result of that, the adults would have to rotate the eggs regularly to prevent the young chick from getting stuck. I mentioned a lot about Tyrannosaurus rex in this lecture already, but I think it is a really cool predator. I'm going to avoid spending a lot of time on this because we're about to finish up and we'll see a video on it. Do know that we think there is sexual dimorphism within these, and of course these other components that we actually asked about this earlier, is it a predator or a scavenger, is debated to a degree, but when it was proposed at the time that it was primarily a scavenger, no one had actually evaluated whether that was a real case or not. We just assumed it was a predator, and so fairly so the question was asked, do we really know that? These are the differences we think between males and females. We have, this is a complete, or roughly complete, large adult, and this is a larger, almost complete adult. This is classically, the one on the bottom is Sue. Sue is the one you're going to see in the video. The one on the top is called Stan. In fact, Sue, we actually know fairly clearly that Sue was a female, and we suspect that Stan was a male. So Sue probably was a large breeding adult female that held a large territory, and animals like Stan would be a smaller male that would try to find or mate with females after they have left their own territory. Stan is, as a result of that, is not quite as large as Sue. He doesn't have to produce eggs, right? So it's probably relatively beneficial to be a little bit smaller and spend more time running around after females than to spend lots more energy to get truly enormous. And then we're going to look at this later as well. This is a growth chart for Tyrannosaurus. What I want you to appreciate here is, again, dinosaurs reach sexual maturity prior to attaining maximum size, but Tyrannosaurs are probably reaching sexual maturity no later than the year of 20. They're absolutely going to be sexually mature by the age of 20. And what you can see is that Tyrannosaurs simply don't get to 30 years old. So these are fairly live fast, die young animals. They're probably going to be relatively cute up until the point where they are increasing exponentially in size, and that would be after just a few years. So there's probably some protection of the juveniles by the adult, probably adult female. It's probably a single individual, and then they probably take off and live on their own. And you can see that Tyrannosaurus is different from these other members of the bipedal theropods, not necessarily in the growing time, right? So it's not the growing time that changes. It's the rate of growth has increased drastically. So these are all growing the same amount of time, but these growth rates are much, much lower. Tyrannosaurs are putting on about 700 to 800 kilograms per year, which is more than a kilogram per day, right? That's a lot of body mass, because to put on a kilogram of material a day, you have to be eating well more than a kilogram of material. So these animals are eating a lot of food, and they're eating it really fast. Good, so that brings us to the end of this lecture, and we're going to now, I'm going to actually not do this, we're not going to move on to Theropod II, which is the rise of birds, but we'll do that next week.